I'm so happy that Dr. O'Malley invited me to take part in this event. It is a huge honor, and I just want to thank you again, Tim, for letting me be a part of it. And thanks to all of you as well for the work you do, for being a part of this event, and for being here to listen to a bit of my story. And I'm glad that, as Jess mentioned, and as Dr. O'Malley made clear to me, that this session was meant to be a sharing of story. Whereas I might be a bit intimidated by the prospect of teaching or lecturing or presenting at an event like this, I'm happy to stand up here and narrate my personal journey, my personal history of Eucharistic living. So, as I was preparing for it, it was kind of tough for me to figure out how to get it started. But I guess it's important to state up front that my story is in fact a very Eucharistic one, even before I was received into the church, and more on that in a minute. Consequently, I can only assume that I'm here at all, here in front of you instead of sitting among you, at least for this hour, because the Eucharistic dimensions of my life story are somehow evident, at least to Tim and his crew, and that I might have a valuable contribution to make to the proceedings. Yet I have to say that I was a bit taken aback when the symposium's webpage appeared a couple months ago. On the roster of speakers, I was listed as a Catholic writer. I did a double take. That's not right, I thought to myself. That's false advertising. Even after blogging and writing now for a number of years, as Jess mentioned, I'm still uncomfortable characterizing myself as a writer. I'm a husband and a father of 7 kids, and my day job, as she mentioned, is teaching nursing. I'm an RN, and I've been teaching nursing now for 15 years at Bethel College, a small evangelical college across town. Seeing that writer label next to my name on the webpage was a kind of epiphany. It was evidence in black and white, at least on the screen, that writer is how I'm perceived by my friends here at Notre Dame. It's evidence that it is in fact part of who I am, that it is who I have become. Assuming that's the case, it's only because I made the decision a number of years ago to put in the time to keep writing and submitting and failing and learning from my mistakes, and to persist in striving to put my cerebral ramblings into words that readers could and would absorb. It's actually at the heart of that whole idea of 1,000 words a week. So it was just to keep me writing. And in that regard, the words of E.L. Doctorow, a novelist, have become my creed. He writes, "Planning to write is not writing. Outlining a book is not writing. Researching is not writing. Talking to people about what you're doing, none of that is writing. Writing is writing." And I'm still not very good at it, but I keep coming back to the keyboard and I keep trying day after day, daily in fact, whenever I can. I want to be a writer, so I keep writing. It's been the same with my Eucharistic identity. It's why I go to daily Mass whenever it's feasible. I make it the centerpiece of my day every day. I wake up thinking about when my getting to Mass would work out best for me and my work and my family. And as I make clear to my curious non-Catholic students, bulk of my students are non-Catholics, I don't go to daily Mass because I'm holy. Far from it. I go to Mass every day because I want to get holy, to be with Jesus, to be Jesus. To paraphrase Doctorow, talking about or thinking about or even writing about communing with Jesus is not communing with Jesus. Communion is communion with Jesus. There was a time when the Eucharist wasn't the center of my world, however. It wasn't the center of my universe. But now it is, by dint of God's grace and the desire that God put in me, put in all of us, for Him. that is, for reality. I've always desperately wanted reality, even when it's hard. Maybe that comes from growing up in an alcoholic household with all the shape-shifting and the illusion that entails. The alcoholism in my upbringing also helps explain why the intentional altering of reality, just because it's hard, has always repulsed me. It's why I was never tempted by drugs or weed as a teenager, even though they were readily available in the Boulder, Colorado of my youth, and many of my friends partook of it. Life is difficult, M. Scott Peck famously wrote on the very first page of his bestseller, The Road Less Traveled. Those were immensely comforting words. But Peck goes on to argue in that book that facing life's hard truths head-on is, quote, more important, more vital to our self-interest than our comfort, end quote. In fact, Peck insisted that such a commitment, as painful as it might be at times, is the very essence of sanity. Quote, mental health is an ongoing process of dedication to reality at all costs. And aren't all of our strivings and yearnings, our frustrations and joys associated with uncovering what's real, grabbing onto what's real, getting our subjective realities in line with actual reality? That is, the reality of senses and substance, edges, lines, and concrete matter, not to mention the reality of right relating to each other and to God. And that's what the Eucharist represents to me. It's reality itself, undistorted and tangible, because it is Christ, the incarnate Word, who is himself the organizing principle and source of what is. In him, as St. Paul writes to the Colossians, all things were created in heaven and on earth. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. If that's true, then nothing else can satisfy. Nothing and no one else can make us whole. We readily make Peter's words to Jesus in John 6 our own. To whom else would we go? You have the words of eternal life. That is, what else is there other than Jesus? What else is there other than reality? And since we encounter and inhabit, or are inhabited by, the reality of Jesus most completely in the Eucharist, it's no surprise that Peter's confession in John 6 follows the bread of life discourse and Jesus' command that we eat his body and blood. So Eucharist is reality therapy. It's what I think J.R.R. Tolkien was getting at in a letter he wrote to his son Michael. Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth. The Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves on earth. When a friend sent that to me, Monsignor Heinz, some of you know, he commented, quote, stunningly beautiful. It is, isn't it? Stunningly beautiful. Because it's so oriented to what is. And we're living in a time when what is, it doesn't count for much. And there's a comic strip that I cut out from the Wall Street Journal a while ago, hanging in our bedroom, that speaks to this. I even found a copy of it on the internet. A mom is seated with her young child at her knee. The mom, evidently responding to a question posed by the child, says, "No, this isn't a reality show. This is reality." It's a lesson that probably needs a much wider audience, because so much of our living these days seems to be rooted in illusion, manipulation, and posture, especially of the electronic variety. For me, to regularly, daily, when possible, approach the Eucharist is to be freed from all that, to be constantly reoriented to the Creator and his creation, and to bring in line again and again my thoughts, my actions, and aspirations with the one who is real, who is reality itself. It's to daily come face to face literally, with that profound theological dictum embedded in the movie Rudy. There is a God, Father Kavanaugh tells Rudy, and I'm not him. That being said, I'd like to share my story, the rest of my story, in terms of Eucharistic absence. That it is my experience of Eucharist as potential embrace of Christ, of communion desired yet delayed. It's the negative side of sacramental reality orientation, a simultaneous acknowledgement of what is real while holding back from submitting to it. It's not altered reality, it's reality postponed, at least temporarily. Jesus' parable of the two sons in Matthew 20:21 illustrates this. The one son accedes to his father's request to work in the vineyard and yet blows him off later on. The second son initially spurns the dad's entreaty, but later complies. The former represents subjection to illusion and lie. The latter, an assent, albeit deferred to what is. That is, an assent to right order and right relationship. That deferred assent in sacramental terms takes a variety of forms, and I'd like to focus on two that mark distinct stages, almost like bookends, in my own Eucharistic story. An early season of romance and a latter season of respectful rapport. I'm hoping you'll find that they resonate with elements of your own stories. So first, the romance of waiting for the Eucharist. My deliberate yet painful holding back from Holy Communion during the period leading up to my reception into the church. So let me back up a little bit first. Growing up, I had no knowledge of the Eucharist, although I'd early on developed a fascination of and strong affinity for the Jesus of the Gospels. Baptized as an infant in the Reformed tradition and raised in an evangelical household, I immersed myself in the only means at my disposal to get more of Jesus. That is, through Bible study, Bible memorization, and all manner of Bible camps and youth activities. This was a good thing, of course, for our encounters with Jesus and the written word are certainly reality-oriented. They're both vitalizing and illuminating. They're nourishing in a way that is both preparatory to and continuous with sacramental nourishment. We really do receive Jesus in the Scriptures, and I was earnest in taking in as much of that word as I could. In college, though, I struggled with the Bible alone, the sola scriptura Christianity of my youth. Reading about Jesus, encountering him on the page, even the pages of the living word, no longer cut it. I wanted more. I wanted more Jesus. And turning to the church, small c, didn't help because there were so many versions of the church. Which was the right one? I knelt with Episcopalians one week. I sat quiet and awkwardly with Quakers the next. And eventually I sampled every other flavor of Protestant Christianity that I could track down. And there were additional problems. As I pored over the Scriptures, I was bothered by what I, in my youthful arrogance, perceived to be our gargantuan chasm between, on the one hand, the Jesus of the Gospels, the one who spent so much time healing the sick and feeding the hungry and confronting social and personal evil, that Jesus, and on the other hand, the lived Christianity I encountered in the various traditions I was sampling. Just want to note there about the youthful arrogance. I didn't see the whole story, but nevertheless, it was a problem for me. Ecumenism seemed to offer some kind of relief on these fronts, like the National and World Councils of Churches. And just as an aside, I want to mention that I saw yesterday in the news in the Wall Street Journal that mentioned that the Holy Father is actually meeting with the World Council of Churches and addressing the council today in Geneva. So ecumenism is alive and well, even for us, even for Catholics. Anyway, so the National Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches, I admired their commitment to spreading the gospel by addressing all kinds of human need, not just spiritual. And so in Eugene, Oregon, where I ended up after college, I found my way to an ecumenical reading group to find out more. Members of this diverse and amiable gathering took turns picking out what we'd all read and discuss every month. I recall struggling with Alfred North Whitehead's process theology one month, and then the next month enjoying the simple directness of Martin Luther's smaller catechism. It was a great group. Learned a lot. When the pick came around to a Catholic couple in the group, former Catholic workers, whatever that meant. They insisted we read an autobiography by some woman named Dorothy Day. It was a graced, providential, life-changing choice, at least for me. I'll never forget the moment I finished it. I was sitting in the University of Oregon Student Center, which they call the fishbowl. I closed the cover, and I said out loud, completely disregarding all the students sitting nearby, "My life will never be the same." Little did I know. I'm sure you're all familiar with Dorothy's book, The Long Loneliness, but you can't imagine how revelatory it was to this young, struggling evangelical. Here was someone who clearly knew the Jesus of the Gospels. Here was someone who evidently lived out Jesus' mandates, plainly and directly, and right here in the U.S., not on the streets of Calcutta or the jungles of the Amazon. Here was, in short, someone I thought could help me find Jesus again, to help me encounter him again and recover a life of faith. When I found, to my disappointment, that this Dorothy Day person had just died a couple years before, I determined to locate her followers, to follow her followers, that is. Through grace and providence, I made my way to the Chicago Catholic Worker of the early 80s and threw myself into the community and its apostolates. I cooked in the soup kitchen, I assisted in offering hospitality to the homeless, and sought understanding of the workers' traditions of peacemaking and promoting the common weal. It was hard work, especially for someone who grew up in comfy Colorado suburbia, but I knew I was on to something. It was a whole new dimension of the reality that I wanted so much. It was Jesus. However, I tied this new revelation of reality exclusively and ecumenically to the worker side of the Catholic worker equation. The Catholic side, to me, was, I'm embarrassed to say now, unessential, almost irrelevant, a distraction and an oddity. In time, however, I came to see that the Catholicism was an integral part of the Catholic worker ethos, not an addendum or an afterthought. Doing that kind of work and living that kind of life increasingly seemed beyond human strength, at least my own. So how did Dorothy and the other early workers do it? How are my friends doing it? And doing it with so much patience, good humor, and bonhomie most of the time. And if you've ever been in a worker house, you know what I mean by that. Certainly, you don't have to be Catholic to be part of a Catholic worker community, but it's sure appeared to help, at least for the heroes that I'd been meeting on the page and on the street. The difference I discovered was that the Catholic workers were fed. They regularly received manna, the way bread of Tolkien's Middle-earth Fellowship. I found that the Catholic workers' extraordinary way of life had always been facilitated and sustained by the life of grace that Christ affords us through his church, the communion of saints, and especially the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist. It made sense that a supernatural work would require a supernatural sustenance, and I slowly, ever so slowly, came to recognize that the Jesus of the Gospels, the same Jesus of the poor I'd been living with in Chicago, was also the Jesus of the Eucharist. Of course, we do receive Jesus in the proclaimed word, and we do receive Jesus through each other. But he also left us with a complete and a very substantial reception of himself by means of the sacraments, especially the sacrament of his body and blood, soul and divinity. And so, could it be? Could it be true? Yes, I couldn't deny it. At some time in 1984, sitting in the basement of the University of Chicago's Divinity School, speaking of ecumenism, I decided that I had to become a Catholic. Not that I wanted to, but that I had to. To paraphrase that comic strip I mentioned earlier, or I showed you earlier, I'd come to the conclusion that Catholicism wasn't just a reality show, it was reality. And so I started receiving instruction from the local priest in Uptown, Father Tom, and my sponsor, Jim, urged me to adopt his practice of daily Mass attendance, which I did a full year before my reception into the church. Jim also taught me to pray the Rosary, pray the Liturgy of the Hours. not to mention how to make spiritual communions. But I knew from Lumen Gentium, this is before the Catechism, so we actually had to read the documents of Vatican II, but I knew from Lumen Gentium that everything about Catholicism led up to and away from the Eucharist. It was Christianity's apex and fount, or as the Catechism later translated that line from Lumen Gentium, the faith's source and summit. For me, however, a candidate for full communion, actual reception of that Eucharist had to wait until Easter, the following Easter. And so every day, I'd accompany Jim up Kenmore Avenue to St. Thomas of Canterbury Church for Mass. In short order, I started going on my own, even when Jim wasn't around. But as I grew in my understanding of sacramental realism, the more I squirmed in my pew when it came time for communion. Sometimes I went up for a blessing from Father Tom, but often I didn't, for it meant a physical proximity to that which I longed for so intensely, which only accentuated my distress. Even so, I still look back on that distress in terms of romance, at least in the old-fashioned sense. And when I say old-fashioned in this regard, I mean Jane Austen. So I think of her Pride and Prejudice, the book for sure, but especially the screen adaptations. In the BBC marathon version, the 6-hour version, which is really the only version, let's admit, Thank you. You detect that Darcy and Elizabeth are head over heels for each other by the end of the 4th episode, and all doubt is removed in the 5th when they exchange the look. That subtle, oh so subtle, wordless interchange of tenderness and affection. Now, if this were a modern cinematic treatment of romance, the look would have led in short order to the sack. And in the BBC version, the look is followed by another 90 minutes of drama, conflict, and complication until all is resolved in the final moments with a chaste nuptial kiss, a preliminary marital consummation long in coming. The prior lengthy courtship makes that kiss way more romantic than the typical Hollywood quickie, not to mention so welcome for us viewers who have accompanied the protagonists on their torturous, amorous journey. Those like me who join the church have almost all of us, have similar torturous journeys with just as many fits and starts and setbacks as Elizabeth and Darcy did. It's no small thing to become a Catholic. And once folks have made it as far as RCIA and everything is clicking, they're anxious to get on with it, to receive the sacraments and commence living out that life of grace they've come to yearn for. Nonetheless, wait they must, even candidates for full communion who, by virtue of their baptism, are technically Catholics already. It might be a romance, but it's still a hardship, as it was for me in Chicago. And yet it's vitally important. For as the U.S. bishops wrote in their guidelines on reception of communion, Catholics, quote, Catholics believe that the celebration of the Eucharist is a sign of the reality of the oneness of faith, life, and worship. There's that word reality again. Non-Catholics are not Catholics. We're not in communion with each other. And so ordinarily, to admit non-Catholics to the Eucharist would be tantamount to a lie, much like extramarital intimacy is a lie, even between the engaged, in that it bespeaks a total life commitment that is not yet present. Waiting is honest. It's true and real. Yet it's also penitential in a very healthy way. The time between a convert's coming to belief in the Eucharist and then finally receiving it at Easter is an extended fast of sorts that goes beyond the Lenten fast. In fact, I think it's more like an Advent fast, another example of romantic expectation and longing. Though not penitential in the same degree as Lent, Advent is supposed to be a time of moderated deprivation, of staying hungry while awaiting the greatest birthday surprise the world has ever known. Christmas is a feast, after all, and we don't want to spoil our appetites, spiritual or otherwise. It's why we wrap presents and hide treats. It's also why we remove the baby Jesus from our nativity scenes until Christmas Eve. The visibly empty manger becomes our focal point, a focal point of our eager longing for the Lord's grand entrance into our lives and into our world. And that longing is deepened by the curious presence throughout Advent of all those other nativity figurines, Mary, Joseph, the shepherds, angel, cattle and sheep, gazing placidly on the empty trough, a month-long waiting for Godot that is spectacularly resolved when the ceramic child is enthroned on December 24th. That's what it's like to have to wait for Holy Communion as a convert. We become like pre-Christmas nativity scenes, and our souls are empty cribs, awaiting the arrival of our Eucharistic Lord. Our trust and our hope are deepened, our faith strengthened, and our love made more pervasive and profound. All who are not receiving Holy Communion, say the bishops in their guidelines, are encouraged to express in their hearts a prayerful desire for unity with the Lord Jesus and with one another. End quote. It's a true Maranatha experience, a true cry of the soul, come, Lord Jesus. For me, the Maranatha gave way to embrace on the Easter Vigil of 1985 when I made my profession of faith, received the sacrament of confirmation, and then supped on the Lord for the first time. After my baptism, it is the fulcrum of my life story, even more so than Dorothy Day's long loneliness. And like many other new Catholics, I was so thrilled to be able to approach the upraised host, say amen, and receive my Lord, that I was back again the next morning, on Easter morning, to attend Mass again, to receive him again. The priest even mentioned it. I blushed, but I didn't care. It's something I've done many times since. Attend the vigil and the return for morning Easter Mass, like a honeymoon, hungry for union as often as possible. And that brings me to this latter, current stage of my Eucharistic story, which I called rapport, or respectful rapport. During the romance, there was an intensity, even an anxiety. Now, especially after 30 plus years in the church, there's confident hope and a lot of freedom. Almost like the kind of latitude my college kids naturally take for granted when they're back with us during breaks. They raid the fridge, they borrow the car, and they sit down for meals with no special invitation. They make themselves at home because they are home. A similar liturgical attitude, or what I call rapport, is in line with the bishop's recommendation that we, quote, receive communion devoutly and frequently, end quote. Especially the frequently part, I think, for it's part of being at home in the church. A scrupulous Eucharistic anorexia is spiritually self-defeating, especially since the Eucharist itself forgives our minor offenses and it helps us offending God in the future. I don't know about you, but if I wait until I think I'm really worthy to receive the Eucharist, I'll never receive it. It's like waiting until we're ready to get married, or waiting until everything's in place to have a baby. We'll never get to that place, and we'll be waiting forever. And I think it's even a good idea to receive communion when we're in a crummy place with God, than not to not receive it at all. Tolkien, in a different letter, seems to agree. Quote, the only cure for sagging or fainting faith is communion. Though always itself perfect and complete and inviolate, the Blessed Sacrament does not operate completely and once for all in any of us. Like the act of faith, it must be continuous and grow by exercise. Frequency is of the highest effect. 7 times a week is more nourishing than 7 times in intervals. End quote. That being said, we also know that participating in Mass isn't just about Holy Communion. It can't be. Because while we're obligated to get there every weekend and Holy Day, we're never required to communicate other than our annual Easter duty. The Sunday school obligation, Sunday school, that's my Protestant Freudian slip there. The Sunday obligation is less about what we might receive than what we're required to bring and give, that is, ourselves in our worship. As the celebrating assembly, we're the lit in liturgy, the community of the baptized who, by regeneration and the anointing of the Holy Spirit, are consecrated to be a spiritual house and a holy priesthood, as the Catechism says, again quoting Lumen Gentium, quote, that through all the works of Christian men, they may offer spiritual sacrifices, end quote. At the very least, it's an issue of justice. We worship God on the Sabbath because it's the right thing to do, whether we receive the Eucharist or not. Okay, but given what I've said about Eucharistic latitude, what would keep me from receiving communion if I'm at Mass, assuming I'm not in outright obstinate rebellion? Another R stage, romance, rapport, rebellion. Another R stage of Eucharistic absence, which we can wait for another talk. Every Holy Communion is Jesus, so why wouldn't I want more Jesus whenever he's available to me if I'm at Mass? Plus, there's this thought from Dom Hubert von Zeller, a Benedictine spiritual writer. He wrote, from one Holy Communion, quote, from one Holy Communion, a soul may derive the grace to become a saint. Just one. My gosh, if he's right, I don't want a chance missing out on that one, do I? Even so, sacramental abstinence at Mass is still occasionally appropriate because the Eucharist, like any sacrament, isn't automatic. It doesn't work moral and spiritual wonders without our cooperation and effort. Dom Hubert himself makes this point. Frequent communion is not magic. The Holy Eucharist does not, as if by a charm, bend an ill-disposed character so that in spite of itself, the soul finds itself rising to the heights. End quote. It's true that Jesus is really present, whether we apprehend him or not, and his grace is present in the sacraments, whether we assimilate it or not. The point is that the apprehending and the assimilating in sacramental encounters requires something of us. That is to say, God does all the heavy sacramental lifting, but we have to do our part. And doing our part means being at least minimally disposed to properly receive him, not just in terms of the state of our souls, that is, no unconfessed grave sin, but also more immediately our minds and our hearts as well. The Church, thankfully, has codified that minimal interior disposition and what we call the communion fast, the avoidance of food and drink other than water a mere hour before we are to receive communion. It's hardly a burden. It's hardly even a fast, especially compared to what used to be the communion fast in the old days that went from midnight on. Now it's only a single hour, and you can even dicker as to whether it ought to be an hour before Mass begins or an hour before you expect to receive the host. You've all been there, right? I know, especially parents. Either way, the fast itself isn't about clearing out our guts to physiologically make room for our Eucharistic Lord, to carve out a nook for him in our alimentary canals. No, it's more about carving out a nook for him in our attention. It's about aligning our schedules and our frame of mind with what we're about to do and partake of in another 60 minutes or so. I believe the communion fast is vitally important for a full flourishing of Eucharistic living, at least for me. Jesus expects us to approach him in Holy Communion with all manner of mixed motives and complicated aspirations. But the very least we can do is to approach him with a nominal openness to what he wants to accomplish in us. An hour of conscientious fasting makes it more likely that we will give some thought, at least, to what communion is all about, becoming whom we eat, really. And that leads me back to the idea of rapport, the being at homeness that I learned while in Chicago, at my parish, yes, in Uptown, but especially in my trips down to St. Peter's in the Loop. It's my favorite church in Chicago. If you know downtown Chicago, you know this Franciscan landmark on Madison between LaSalle and Clark, with its pink granite facade and the enormous stone crucifix out front. They have confessions and masses all day throughout the week. It's right in the middle of the Loop, particularly at midday to serve the lunch crowd who wants to dart in to make a visit, kneel, go to confession, receive the Lord. Before I was a Catholic, but living at the Catholic Worker, I used to take the subway down to St. Peter's to go to Mass and just rest there. In truth, to take a nap. Which can be a luxury at a Catholic Worker house. You often have to find someplace else. And you can't sleep in the library, so you go to St. Peter's in the Loop. At least that's what I did. In between naps, I used to watch carefully as people came and went, seemingly at ease, just walking up for communion and then leaving again, even if they weren't there for the whole Mass. Also, there were plenty of others like me who just hung around there. Probably some who were homeless, sure, but others appeared to be office workers and laborers who were evidently prayerful and pious, but also reluctant to approach the altar to receive the Lord. They, like me, I can only assume, just enjoyed being there with Jesus and with his crowd. It's the same today. When I go to Mass, I'm going to be with an old friend, a friend who knows me well, knows me better than I know myself. And I'm content to relax in his presence, even if I don't receive Holy Communion. That applies to Sunday mornings when I thoughtlessly grab a donut on the way out the door to church, but also those occasional random Mondays or Thursdays when I make my way to the only daily Mass I can get to, even after I've downed a bagel or a burrito. I go to Mass every day because I want to be with him, to be there where he is, to talk with him and to listen. Although, to tell the truth, I do more talking than listening, but I'm working on that. That is, I want to commune with him, whether or not I can receive communion. It's like being at home with him, even when I, out of respect, have to forgo inviting him to take up residence in me. That doesn't happen often, but when it does, I'll find my way to my usual spot on the Mary side of the church, between Simon of Cyrene and St. Veronica. I'll throw my arms back across the pew, and I'll bask in the liturgy. Such days are unanticipated little gifts that hearken back and remind me to my youthful romance of Eucharistic fasting. I get to briefly relive the anticipation of my eager Catholic wannabe days, and I'll leave all the more eager to properly anticipate actual communion with my Lord the next day. Thank you. I believe there's time for Q&A.
Yes. So what I was thinking is before that, why don't you take a moment on your own? So one of the goals of this exercise is by listening to a story, we start to understand our own stories. We start to sort of think about our own Eucharistic life. So why don't you take a moment and think a little bit based upon Rick's talk, your own sort of hunger and sort of Eucharistic desire. It may take 5 minutes just by yourself to do that, and then we'll return and you'll have a chance to sort of talk to Rick about it, and then we'll transition to our second sort of performance of the story. So, not to, I didn't want to say that. I meant I was Okay, so would anyone like to ask Rick a question? This is somewhat different than your normal question asking, right? So it's not like an academic question, which is really a sort of secret statement. But it's a chance to sort of ask a question about Rick's life and living out the Eucharist, or perhaps to share a bit of their own insight that was brought to sort of your own insights from your own lives that were brought forward by listening to Rick.
Hi, Rick. I would like to hear a little bit more about how the Eucharist bleeds into your life as a nurse and your family, because it seems that this is such a powerful part of your life that it certainly has repercussions in what you do outside of Mass. That's still part of your Eucharistic life, right?
Yes, thank you for asking that. I, of course, was constantly, as I was preparing my talk, telling my story, there was all kinds of things I wanted to shove in there, but I couldn't put everything in. But I appreciate the question, because it gives me a chance to talk about those things, which are very much a part of my life, especially my family. Nancy, our Eucharistic family life is certainly centered around that Sunday obligation. That my kids, they may not remember anything else from their formation in the faith, growing up and leaving home, and 20 years from now, they may not remember anything about what the church teaches, but they will remember that we need to worship God on Sundays and holy days. That getting to Mass is part of the identity of being a Catholic, and certainly part of our family culture, essential. And as I mentioned in my talk, not just to receive communion, but out of justice, really. That we owe God our worship. We are there to give, not just to get. So I think that at the heart of our sort of Eucharistic family identity. And certainly in terms of the communion fast, we all laughed when we were talking about whether you figure it an hour before Mass starts or an hour before you think you're going to have, then you're kind of rolling the dice there. But that is certainly, regardless of how you figure it, I do think that constitutes a bare minimum in terms of preparing to receive the Lord. It's a way of, at least for that hour, you're going to be thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to be receiving Jesus. So that's how I would respond to that. It is, in terms of our family Eucharistic identity, in terms of how I teach nursing, and this is a curious thing because I teach at an evangelical college, and my approach to nursing and my approach to nursing education is definitely oriented to a Matthew 25 vision, which is a Catholic worker vision of service. That when we serve the sick, I teach my students. Let me put it this way: we talk about spiritual care, and often for my students, they think of spiritual care as when they have an opportunity to share Scripture with their patients or pray with their patients. I try to help them have a bigger vision, which is that when we serve the sick, we're serving Jesus. And that when we're serving the sick out of love and out of compassion, we are Jesus. So the encounter between caregiver and those receiving care becomes this holy ground. And it's not an idea that's, they don't have a sacramental kind of context, so they have to take some time to develop kind of an understanding of that. But that's certainly how I've always tried to practice my nursing, and it's how I try to teach it too. Thank you.
Thank you. Some people seem to think that because we're religious, we have an inside line to God. That isn't so. For the past 10 years, I can understand what Dorothy Day went through in her long loneliness. I've been going through that. Like you, the only thing that has kept me going is Mass and communion. Sometimes, for just a fleeting moment, I feel that He is there. And when that happens, I always remember the phrase from Matthew's last gospel, I am with you always.
Thank you for that, and I wish to tie into that too. What helps with me, I just celebrated my 18th year of anniversary of ordination, and I hope to God I have many more years of doing that. But I remember even going back to September 11th, 2001, when I just was ordained a little bit over a year as a priest, and we had Mass at noon at my parish. I was in Boone, North Carolina at the time, and I'm very thankful. I had no idea what in the world to do other than celebrate Mass and just ask for just the Lord to pour down grace and love upon the people there who were shaken by the news, even by people who didn't even know what was going on until they got to Mass. And they're like, why are there more people here at noon than there usually are? And so that's where receiving the Eucharist on a day such as that was just a great source of healing for people there. And I hope and pray that all of us, that we're able to encourage people at moments like that. That's when we need them even more. And so I'm thankful that even if we don't know what to say or don't know what to do, it's that you know how when Paul talks about those groanings of the Spirit, it was like a real groaning of the Spirit kind of moment. It's like celebrate Mass, lift it up, and ask each other to lift up each other. So that's why I hope and pray that we're able to lift up each other in a Eucharistic way too. And I had a bit of a repeat this week. One of my mom's sisters died Monday night, and this is the second sibling that died within 10 days. So I'm glad I could celebrate Mass for my Uncle George and my Aunt Jane, and help God lift up everybody in the family that way.
Thank you.
Do you practice nursing, or are you strictly a teacher at this point?
I'm only at the bedside with my students. Yeah, so
The reason I'm asking is, do you share any devotional practices with your students, or have you in the past shared any devotional practices with patients? And given restrictions possible, I'm guessing, with laws and things, are you able to, and does that deter you? Like saying a rosary, or I'm from Buffalo, so St. Faustina with our Polish heritage there is big with her Divine Mercy. Are you able to do something like that, or do you not practice devotional things, or?
you're talking about in the clinical setting at this point, not just the classroom, right? Or
Correct.
both?
Both. Either
Okay.
or both.
Okay. Well, I have the great privilege and blessing to not only be teaching at a Christian school, it's evangelical. They tolerate me though. Papist in their midst. But I also I take my students for clinicals, what we call in nursing speak clinicals, where we take what we learn in the classroom and actually go to the bedside and take care of real patients at Catholic facilities, a Catholic nursing home in the fall, and then in the spring I'm with them in a Catholic hospital. So the answer to your question is yes. In the classroom, in the clinical setting, my students and I are free to voice our faith, to pray with patients, which is wonderful. So I would imagine in a like a state-run hospital or a facility that did not have a church affiliation, that would be a little bit different. But my experience has been a lot of freedom, and it is integrated in that way in terms of that vision that I shared with you about seeing Jesus in the sick, which wouldn't necessarily be voiced, but to be thinking about that I am caring for Jesus, per what he said in Matthew 25, but then to be able to integrate that with caring for spiritual needs very directly. Can I pray with you? Or I see you have a rosary. Do you want me to call the priest? Would you have any need? Would you like to receive communion? Things like that. So, yes, in my case. But I don't know about nurses that would be in other settings.